team. I'm, Thank you, Renee. I'm joined by two of my colleagues who've helped plan this training, Katie Lacey and Shelley and Renee. And I think I see Laura on here and other members of the community assistance team. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. The series is funded in part by the bank, the Eastern Bank Foundation. So we're grateful to them for their support. A few housekeeping items. If you can put questions and comments in the chat, we'll keep track of them throughout and pause for questions after each presentation. If you'd like to turn on Zoom's closed captions, you can do so in the bottom toolbar. And if you have any issues, you can send a direct message to Renee. And then please keep yourself muted during the training. Please also remember to log CM credits. The details for that are also on the Housing Toolbox page. And then lastly, when you leave this meeting, there will be a Zoom pop-up to give feedback. Please give your feedback. We incorporated a lot of it from last year into this year's iteration of the training, so we really take that seriously. So today we are here with the final module, and we are examining why local support is critical for board and commission success. This support can take many forms, including advocacy groups, attendance at public meetings, submitting public comments, among others. And we're really going to use this final session to get the kind of a statewide perspective, the municipal perspective, and then a really interesting model for bringing together boards who support affordable housing. So we'll first hear from Lily Link, the Director of Education and Action at the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, better known as CHAPA. We'll then hear from Amy Callahan, Community and Economic Development Director, and Anna Altman, Community Development Administrator, both from the City of Greenfield. And then we will wrap up hearing from Keith Bergman, Concord's Municipal Affordable Trust Housing Chair. We'll talk about the roundtable model that they've implemented in Concord. So with that, I will turn it over to Lily.
Thanks so much, Emma, and thanks for having me here today. I always love spending time with our friends at MHP. I'll just get my slides up. So as Emma said, my name's Lily Link. I'm the Director of Education and Action at CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association. And we're here to talk about the importance of bringing together resident advocates, government officials, local community organizations, service providers together in the work of making housing happen. If you're not familiar with CHAPA, we are a nonprofit organization that's been around for almost 60 years. We advocate for the production and preservation of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families and individuals. And we do that in a lot of different ways through some programs I'm going to talk about in a moment. We believe that every person in Massachusetts should have a safe, healthy, and affordable place to live, and we do this by advocating for opportunity, expanding access to housing, and developing the field. There are a couple programs that I personally oversee in my capacity as Director of Education and Action that I wanted to tell you all about because they very much inform the lessons that I am bringing to this. And also because if you are not aware of them, I wanted you to know that there are additional opportunities out there for support and technical assistance. The first is our Massachusetts Housing Leadership Academy, which is a free 6-month fellowship designed to empower local officials. So we're talking mayors, city councilors, planning boards, select board, zoning board of appeals, finance committees, really anyone on an elected or appointed role that touches housing policy in some way at the municipal level, to support them in engaging their constituents in creating thriving communities with homes for people of all ages, incomes, and abilities. So through this program, we have monthly cohort meetings, monthly seminars with expert speakers, that empower these participants, these fellows, to understand, where our housing shortage comes from, what's the history behind that, what tools are available to them to address it, how do they get residents on board by being able to meaningfully address their concerns, to bring them along in the community engagement process, and to build that support that is needed at the local level. And the long-term goal, this is a new program that we actually just launched in January. We're in the midst of our first semester. But our long-term goal is to be able to really build out a statewide network of local housing leaders that have this shared training and experience and can support each other moving forward. We also have the Municipal Engagement Initiative, which was our kind of inaugural program, how our team came to be. That program was founded in 2018. And in the Municipal Engagement Initiative, we work with residents on the ground to build pro-housing coalitions really from the ground up and help them change the conversation and support existing local efforts to create and preserve affordable housing. And part of why we do this is that we know that housing is built at the local level, but many, many, many communities lack any kind of really organized, well-resourced pro-housing coalitions. We know this partly because of some research that came out of Boston University. There was a report called Neighborhood Defenders, Participatory Politics and America's Housing Crisis that I strongly recommend you check out. This was done by Catherine Einstein, Maxwell Palmer, and David Glick, and they observed literally thousands of hours from hundreds of meetings across communities all around Massachusetts to look at who was making comments on housing projects and what they were there to say. And this was just not just affordable housing, any meeting related to potential housing development. And what they found was that the folks who showed up when compared against registered voters as a whole were overwhelmingly whiter, male, older homeowners, and they showed up to oppose new housing developments. And we know that all of our communities are made up of, regardless of what the percentage is, of people who are outside of that group. Tenants, younger adults, people of color, immigrants, women, young families. But those voices are really not being represented in a lot of these meetings. And we know that oftentimes all it takes is a small group of vocal opponents to kill the creation of homes. And it has stopped the creation of thousands of homes over the last few decades. So we saw a need to really counterbalance that by bringing in a more organized, well-resourced pro-housing group to these conversations. So in doing that for the last 8 years, we've worked with residents in 45 unique communities across the state. Each coalition takes on a slightly different approach depending on where they want to focus, what opportunities are coming up in the short term, the kind of form of their community. We've worked in big cities, we've worked in small towns and rural areas. So they each look a little bit different, but some of the things that we have achieved with these coalitions include advocating for new affordable housing development opportunities, so actually getting projects built, establishing affordable housing trusts, often in partnership with the support provided by Shelley and MHP, expanding accessory dwelling unit bylaws. This was before the Affordable Homes Act, when now ADUs are the law of the land, but for a long time that was not the case, and we had a lot of communities work to make it easier to build accessory dwelling units, passing multifamily zoning, both through the MBTA Communities Act and outside of it, passing the Community Preservation Act at the local level to provide a new funding source for housing, passing housing production plans, getting pro-housing officials elected, and more. So you can see that sometimes we focus on production, sometimes it's funding, sometimes it's more about making sure that the support exists within the local government. And the coalitions that we bring together are big tent coalitions. We want to reach beyond the usual suspects because every town has that handful of wonky, passionate housing people. But we want to reach beyond that. We want to bring in local business owners, houses of worship, faith leaders, environmental advocates, transit advocates, cultural groups, renters, developers, and really anyone who believes that people deserve safe, affordable, and accessible housing. A lot of the work that we do is about finding people who are already engaged in their community in some capacity. Maybe their focus is schools, maybe their focus is safer streets, maybe their focus is climate resiliency, and help them see how housing growth and smart housing growth is actually in service of the issue that they care about as well. Um, because these are people who already have community connections. They are trusted voices. They tend to know a lot of people, understand how these systems of change work. And so those are the folks we want to be. You don't need to think of yourself as a housing person. If you're someone who cares about your community, stays involved, stays connected, and wants to be a part of that process of change, then we want you at the table. So I wanted to share a few success stories over the years, and talk about some of the lessons that we took away from those stories. So in Greater Newburyport, we launched a housing coalition in 2024 was the beginning of that process. And it included 5 different towns around Greater Newburyport. And this was a slightly different approach for us to take. We do not typically do regional coalitions, although one of the takeaways from this experience was that when you're dealing with smaller communities, sometimes going regional can actually be a really, really effective tool. So the application to participate in the Municipal Engagement Initiative was actually initiated by someone in Newburyport who was a former Affordable Housing Trust board member, and from her work in that role, really saw the need for more resident support. In the course of the year and change that we worked with them, and you can see my colleague Monica Keel in the center with some of the steering committee members of the coalition, they published over 30 articles in the Newburyport News with stories about fair housing, housing vouchers, local development projects, as well as just personal stories from residents about housing and their experience of housing. And this was just one of the ways that they were trying to do some public education and recruit more potential members to participate. They formed working groups for legislation and projects. So they had some of their members that were focused on legislative advocacy, others were focused on like actual physical projects that they wanted to advocate to get built. There were a couple that they were, and in some cases are continuing to work on. They co-hosted a North Shore pro-housing summer social in Ipswich with Abundant Housing Massachusetts, one of our partner organizations, and Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll came to be a keynote speaker. And as you can see, it was a very successful. That picture on the bottom is just a small portion of the room. It was a very fun and exciting night. Lots of people coming out, and a lot of new relationships that were spurred from this summer social. And then lastly, one of their biggest victories was that they advocated successfully for the redevelopment of the vacant Brown School, which had been sitting empty for a very, very long time. And it will now become 29 new homes, all of which will be deeply affordable. So for 60% AMI or below, 60% area median income, I should say, or below. And so you can see that this group took on they used a lot of the tools in their tool belt. They wrote op-eds and news stories to educate the public and get the word out to people who might not hear about them otherwise. They partnered with, this is one thing I didn't mention, they partnered very closely with the YWCA Newburyport, which provided them with a meeting space and resources and support, because the YWCA saw this work as very much a part of their mission as well, because they are very committed to social justice. They see that as part of their work at the YWCA in Newburyport. They used, what I would say are some of the kind of the best practices in terms of how to organize themselves by having these working groups, having people that were sort of each focused in their own area, but able to share information and uplift one another's work. They reached out to communities even beyond the 5 in their little regional group through that summer social, which enabled them to feel more connected to their region as a whole, and not just the kind of on a logistical level, the relationships that come out of those connections, but also it warms people's spirits. It makes them feel empowered and less alone when they go to an event like this, in addition to just the value of networking and meeting other people that you could potentially work with. So I think the Greater Newburyport Housing Choice Coalition is a really excellent example of a lot of the tools that can be used to help advance change and also to build out that infrastructure of the coalition, because it's one thing to get a victory. You successfully get some sort of rezoning passed, you successfully establish a trust, or you successfully get some new housing built. But if you're not building a group infrastructure that is sustainable in the long term, you'll get that one exciting victory, and then that will probably be the end of the coalition. So they really set themselves up for success in terms of being able to carry forward even now that they have graduated from MEI. And you'll hear me say MEI as a shorthand for Municipal Engagement Initiative because my mouth gets tired of saying Municipal Engagement Initiative 1,000 times a day. So another MEI success story is our Revere Housing Coalition. This coalition, we worked with them between 2020 and 2022. And so in that first year and a half or so, they really ended up unexpectedly. The launch meeting we had was in February of 2020. We thought it would be a very different kind of experience, ended up having to do a big pivot. And that group chose in the immediate term to focus really on mutual aid and community support. And they formed all these different working groups for, food assistance and helping people with their healthcare, translation, things like that. This was a group that was comprised really predominantly, if not almost entirely, of women, women of color, and immigrants, many of whom have really, really deep community ties, either work for or volunteer with other community organizations. And so for them, they felt like the first thing they wanted to focus on was just making sure people were okay in the immediate term, while they also were having these conversations about broader systemic changes that they wanted to make within their community. Some of the many things that they did really well and achieved were, for one, they included their planners, their city councilors, and the mayor in meetings. The mayor actually attended a couple of our meetings, and there was a really much closer working relationship was developed through this process that CHAPA was able to facilitate, because heading into the beginning of launching this coalition, there was a lot of tension and definitely not a lot of trust between the government and the coalition members. But through a lot of hard work, they managed to establish an affordable housing trust. And some members of the coalition have actually now served on the Affordable Housing Trust board. And in fact, one of them is now part of our Housing Leadership Academy. So it's been this really cool process of, like, we met her through launching the coalition back in 2020. We worked together to create the trust. In the years since we stepped back, she became part of the board of the trust, and now she's returning to us to receive new support in the form of the Housing Leadership Academy. So I think that's a really cool kind of full circle moment of us being able to reconnect in moments when more support is needed, but to see how things have continued to grow. In addition, not only have members of the coalition served on the Affordable Housing Trust Board, they have also served on the Housing Authority Board, the Housing Production Plan Advisory Committee, and the Community Land Trust Steering Committee. So this is an example of one of the things we're always working towards, which is to empower these coalition members to the point that they are actually sitting at tables they never were sitting at before, where they're actually in the seat of decision-making power in a way that was never, ever possible for them before. And so we definitely look back on our time with Revere as a real success in terms of the way that truly at the local level, the power dynamic of who was making these decisions, who was part of these conversations, changed really significantly. So all of that, I will leave you with sort of my final parting thoughts on keys to success. First off, maintaining ongoing collaboration with municipal staff, elected officials, and community organizations is so important. In many of our coalitions, the community planner would attend almost every time. That's not a requirement, but it is certainly helpful to have municipal staff be engaged, because I think it's mutually beneficial in the sense that the coalition really values and benefits from hearing directly from municipal staff people about what's going on, what's coming down the pipeline. In any municipality, there's always a million projects going on. It can be really hard to keep track. So this ensures that everyone knows what's happening and is on the same page. If the coalition has concerns about something that's coming down the pipeline, they can raise those early on. And then, of course, community organizations, especially, any community organization that provides services like a food pantry, a place where people could go and get healthcare or legal services. Maintaining connections with them is really critical as well because they, better than anyone, know really what's happening on the ground. Maintaining a group structure, so having a steering committee, having dedicated working groups in addition to that general membership. You need to have someone at the wheel, or a small group of someone's at the wheel to ensure that things keep moving. Obviously, you want to continue to grow your membership, but if you have 100 people in your coalition, but none of them are willing to step up and take some ownership over it, it's going to be really hard to make progress. Part of that structure also includes, having regular, reliable monthly meetings, and educational forums and social events so that people can connect with you in a variety of ways. If there's someone who isn't really ready to commit to being a member but is curious to learn from you, they might come to a forum, a webinar, or a panel you might organize. Or maybe the most you could get is just have them to stop by a community barbecue where you're not even gonna make them talk about housing. It's just a way to let them know that you exist. And so making sure that you're providing a lot of different ways for people to engage, not just like come to our meeting every month, or if you're not willing to do that, you can't really participate. Continuous outreach through events, print and social media, and one-on-one conversations. Again, trying to meet people where they're at and provide a lot of different ways to engage with your work. In the case of smaller communities, I think there's a lot of benefit in taking a regional approach. We have had experiences trying to start coalitions in towns of less than 5,000 people, and it's possible, but it is very challenging. There is a certain just numbers game to it inherently, and if you can't get enough people, it's really hard to get a coalition launched and surviving in the long run. Engaging residents of all ages and backgrounds, especially tenants, parents with young children, and local business owners, tend to have a much different perspective on the issue than someone who has owned their home for 30 years and isn't personally concerned about their housing future. People are particularly sympathetic to local business owners, especially if it's like a beloved community business that's been around for 50 years. If that person comes into a town meeting and says, "Hey, if we don't build more housing, my business is going to close because I don't have enough customers," that goes a really long way, way longer than just a comment from any other random person. And lastly, and most importantly, being proactive with your communication, not waiting until those who are opposed to a project get their message out first and have to be in a reactive, defensive position, trying to clean up that misinformation and put that cat back in the bag. Whether you are an elected official or a resident advocate, you have a message you want people to hear. If you're advocating for a project, you obviously have a perspective on why you think it's beneficial. So make sure that you are getting that positive message out there first. Let the opponents be the one that have to find a way to respond to you. Um, and so with that, my last announcement is that we have a bunch of things coming up. In the next couple weeks, the Municipal Engagement Initiative is accepting 4 new communities. So again, that's the one where we're working with resident advocates on the ground. The Housing Leadership Academy applications open next week. We'll be accepting 35 applicants for next semester, which will run June to December. And then we have some free webinars coming up, and this is open to anyone. In a couple weeks, we are doing Building Local Support for Housing, kind of some of the same themes we'll be talking about today, but in an expanded format. And in May, I will be offering my Storytelling for Change webinar, which is all about how we can use case making and storytelling to help get people on board with our cause. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it back to Emma.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. And it was great to see you highlight Revere as well. We had Laura Holmes join last year. to talk about their work. So it's great to hear about all the on the ground work and how they join leadership roles. That's wonderful to hear. So a quick question in the chat here is, are you aware of whether this work was all volunteer-based or was there funding in the mix for these advocacy groups? Anything you want to say on that?
Yeah. So we were able to receive some funding to provide sustainability grants to a few of the coalitions, which in some case, for example, in Revere, we actually did pay stipends to some of the kind of coalition leads to make it more feasible for them to kind of put the time into it that was really demanded of them in order to be successful. And then we have had some other communities where those grants were used more for materials, like to enable them to, get nice posters printed they could use at a tabling event, or to be able to, launch a website, which, you often have to pay, or like if you have a MailChimp mailing list, that costs money. So we were able to do that in the last couple of years for some of our communities. It is tricky, especially when it comes to the stipends on just like a purely logistical level, can be really tricky because technically that person is now an employee of your organization. So there is like the paperwork reality. I know from being on our side of it that there was a lot of like difficulty for all parties involved because you can't just understandably just give money to someone and not need to then be able to track where it went. So that aspect is a little logistically tricky, but when we are able, if we have the funding to be able to give some of that money to the coalitions, that is always the goal when we have it. So I would say when we can, we do, but we have not from year to year. It really depends on what our funding looks like that year.
Thanks, Lily. And there was a question in the chat about creating a kind of bylaw. So usually these groups exist outside of town governance, like they exist independently. So sometimes they might help write a bylaw, but in terms of how their governance structure exists, it's not necessary for that to be written for them to exist, if that makes sense. So this is something.
Yeah. It's not like a formal
Yeah.
committee or commission as part of the town. Exactly. Yeah. And some of them have chosen to seek out 501c3 status. I don't think anyone's ever been a C4, but I think a couple of them are C3s. That's not a process we necessarily like recommend or don't recommend. It creates opportunity. It makes it easier to fundraise and stuff. Or to pay volunteers, but it obviously creates a lot of paperwork for whoever's involved. So most of them keep it a lot more informal for the sake of not making their lives more complicated.
And Lily, could you talk a little bit too about the variety of ways that people can be involved in these groups? Like it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to a meeting every single week for an hour, but just the variety of ways that people can be involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, people are going to take their own approach, but the general structure I recommend is a steering committee of about 5 or 6 people who are willing to really kind of take ownership for making sure the lights stay on and the wheels keep moving. I'm mixing metaphors, but then each of those steering committee members has sort of an area that they oversee. So you need someone who's going to do more of that admin, taking notes, sending out reminder emails. I recommend having folks on the steering committee who might focus on policy, doing some of that research, like what might we want to pursue and what would that take? Having 1 or 2 steering committee members who are really into the kind of community engagement and outreach piece, who are willing to go table at the farmers market or go in Essex. Our coalition members would just hang out at the transfer station on Saturday mornings with coffee and donuts, and they met a lot of people that way, just hanging out at the dump. So that's always an option. So then within those different kind of focus areas, ideally you want to have some sort of team or working group of people who are maybe not at the commitment level of a steering committee, but are saying like, I'll show up to the monthly meeting and I'll step in for other events like here and there when need be. And then you have that broader membership of people who are on your mailing list. Maybe if you like have a Facebook group, they're part of that. They'll show up when something is really important, like make or, town meeting vote, like this is the moment, make or break. That's when they'll come out of the woodwork. They might sign on to a letter, but they're not going to be that like reliable showing up every month force. But you need to make sure you're cultivating and maintaining that as well, because that's the base you want to be able to mobilize. So, what I always tell people is if you can give me 1 minute a month, I'll find something to do with it. Or if you can give me all the time in the world, I will also find something to do with it. But I really do try to always think about how can we provide as many different ways to, whether it's just like sign your name to this thing, come to this one meeting, give us $1 for lawn sign, whatever little thing you can do. It really does, like it adds up. And I think people also, in many ways, overestimate the amount of work it takes to make a difference. 10 people showing up to a public hearing with well-crafted, positive statements about a project can turn an entire process around. I think people often think like, oh, I just can't commit to that because I can't be spending hours and hours every day going to meetings or researching housing policy. And I mean, most of us can't, I mean, that's my job, but most of us can't do that. But if you're willing to show up when it really counts and just put your voice out there, I think people underestimate how much power they actually have.
Thanks so much, Lily. That's really helpful.
Okay.
So now that we've heard a little bit about the value of these groups and how they can form and maintain momentum and the variety of ways that you can be involved, we're going to move over to the municipal perspective and a little bit about the value of groups at the municipal level to help get things done, keep them encouraged and accountable. And so we will move over to Greenfield and I will hand it over to, I believe, Anna. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you, Emma. My name is Anna Oltman. I work for the City of Greenfield in the Department of Community and Economic Development. So I'm going to share a little bit about Greenfield for those unfamiliar and give you a sense of the housing context here. And then my director, Amy Cahaleen, is going to walk you through a couple of case studies. You can switch to the next slide, Amy.
No, I can't. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. So Greenfield is a city, but it's a small city. We have about 17,000 residents. We're located right on the Connecticut River in Franklin County, which is the most rural county in Massachusetts. But Greenfield itself is certainly urbanized, especially in the downtown. Although we do have a little bit of both in the city, urban and rural. The city developed quite a bit in the 19th and early 20th century as a manufacturing hub along the river, but the economy now is mostly healthcare services and a growing and really cool creative economy. Even though we're the county seat for Franklin County, and I think arguably the town with a lot going on and the place to be, it's also a place where the median income is relatively low compared to some of our neighbors. And we have a mix of land uses, which again makes it a cool place to live. There's agricultural land, conservation land, and wildlife, but a very urbanized and dense downtown too. So there's obviously no single cause of our housing crunch, but I think one that the city is hyper aware of at the moment is the demographic shift that we're experiencing and expect to continue experiencing with a ballooning population of seniors over the age of 65. We're expecting the portion to essentially double in the coming decades. And what this means is that we have a large number of seniors who are looking to downsize while staying within this cool community that they love, but they don't really have anywhere to go because the housing stock is primarily single family. And speaking of the housing stock, we've had a pretty dismal housing production over pretty much since the mid-century. And I think in part this made Greenfield a relatively affordable place to live because our housing stock was relatively old. There was a lot of deferred maintenance, and it was possible for people to buy a property relatively affordably compared to some of our neighbors. That's no longer the case. We still have few new units and aging housing stock, but prices have gone way, way, way up. And so this sort of leaves people stuck. There's nowhere to move within your community, even though people want to stay here, and it really disfavors mobility, young families, but like I said, seniors as well. So from the city's perspective, that leaves us with sort of two goals. Number one, build. We need to build new housing. But number two, to diversify and make sure that there's units available for different types of people and different types of families. And next slide. So I think by the 2010s, the city was already really feeling this housing crunch. Like I said, there's this aging population. And in Greenfield, our seniors are relatively politically active. And they certainly, or many of them certainly saw the writing on the wall in terms of housing. And then also in the 2010s, we experienced an uptick in visible unsheltered homelessness, which I think just really upped the political salience of housing in Greenfield and put it on the radar of the public, and also I think led to electing more leaders who were very housing focused. So this became really salient for us. So city staff were aware of this, but also aware that we needed help. It's a relatively small staff. And there wasn't necessarily a ton of housing expertise. So we reached out to partners early on, and I think Greenfield really benefited from this. Around this time in the early 2010s, our county council of governments was working with CHAPA on an initiative called Improving Housing to Improve Health. And this sort of introduced CHAPA and Greenfield housing advocates to each other, and led to a municipal engagement initiative, like Lily talked about, which we have absolutely benefited from and continue to today, because what they did was they worked with an existing advocacy group in Greenfield called Greening Greenfield, which is focused on environmental sustainability originally, but they were branching out and were interested absolutely in housing issues. So there was already an organization that existed that a lot of people were involved in, and they started by forming just a housing committee, a subcommittee of Greening Greenfield, which then sort of birthed into its own organization called Housing Greenfield, which is our primary advocacy organization for housing now, and as Amy will show, has been hugely impactful in some of the developments we've done. Next slide. So just to sort of sum up what this has taught us before Amy takes you through some of the cases, like I said, I do think Greenfield has elected relatively pro-housing officials, but having a progressive policy orientation might be necessary, but it's not enough. In terms of city capacity, right, we need our partnerships with other agencies to help us get projects off the ground. And also we need partners in the community who are advocating for these progressive policies. It's not enough just for your elected officials to be kind of on a pro-housing phase. And we've leaned into our partnerships, like I said, because of our low capacity, and because that is how things really work in smaller, more rural areas, as Lily talked about. We've leaned upwards towards statewide organizations and had a lot of assistance from the state government and from public-private organizations. And we've also leaned sort of laterally and towards our communities across Franklin County. The city partners with, as I said, Housing Greenfield and advocacy groups, but also neighborhood groups who aren't necessarily focused on housing as their number one goal, but recognize how it's interconnected with other policies they care about, affordable housing advocates, land trusts, and really developed basically a local network that supports the city's housing goals. And Amy will talk a little bit about what that has looked like.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects. 2 relatively briefly, and then one that we are deep in the weeds of right now, a little bit in a little bit more depth. When I think about Housing Greenfield, our housing advocates, for me, they play two slightly different roles. One is very outward public facing advocacy, which is the showing up matters. It's the people that show up to community engagement sessions and the people that show up to zoning board. And then one is internally as a political cover for either the mayor advocating to the community, or for me as the community and economic development director advocating to the mayor. I'm fortunate that we have a mayor who is very pro-housing, and yet she has to make difficult political decisions. And our housing advocacy group has been incredibly helpful in giving me some cover and some friendly, gentle nudging so that I can go to the mayor and say, hey, I'm hearing a lot about this issue. And it isn't just me telling those stories. So each of these developments has had different levels of engagement, and I'll just walk through a little bit some of the steps that were the most helpful for me as a municipal employee or for the mayor. So first is Wilson's redevelopment. Wilson's in downtown Greenfield was a beloved downtown department store that closed, remained closed for a while, but had businesses on the first floor that remained open and active. And it was subsequently purchased through a partnership with Community Builders, who is the affordable housing developer, our local co-op grocery store, who will be taking over the first floor, and then Mass Development, who has been a critical partner, both in holding the real estate until a couple of financing things have fallen into place and in providing some financing for this project. I think this project has been through every possible committee at the city level, CPC, planning, zoning, and at each level, we've had community supporters and housing advocates that have shown up to speak in support. For this project in particular, it was very important because, again, there were first floor commercial tenants that needed to be relocated. And in one instance, we had a commercial tenant who refused to leave, and it became a very politically challenging scenario for the mayor, because of course we don't want to, as the municipality, speak out and take a side against a local small business. And so it just became a very sticky conversation. And with our housing advocates who continued to show up and speak up and advocate for the importance of this as a housing development in Greenfield, that enabled the mayor to also champion this project as critical to housing in Greenfield while trying to stand by the side of the small business who was fighting relocation. So just having that political cover outwardly and publicly was important for the mayor. Internally, this project also, in addition to being at every city committee, I think, has almost every possible funding source included in its capital stack, and that included contributions from the city of primarily ARPA funding. And housing advocates, again, were important in pushing the mayor to take some of that ARPA funding and put it towards housing in Greenfield, and this project in particular. It's going to be 61 units of mixed income housing, and 61 units of housing for Greenfield is life-changing, earth-shattering, just an enormous project located right in the heart of our downtown. And it was housing advocates that gave the mayor that cover to move that ARPA funding forward. Also downtown on Main Street, 176 Main. This is another project that currently is 3 commercial units and is a 1-story and is being redeveloped into affordable housing going upwards, as you see in the picture here. This project, like Wilson's before it, and like I think every affordable housing project, has encountered the I hate to say typical, but I'll say typical pushback around people that have perceptions of what affordable housing means, what it looks like physically, what they perceive the people who will live in affordable housing to be, who they think that those people will be. And both in this development in particular, and also in the prior, our affordable housing developer, I think, has been has done a great job of partnering with our housing advocate group to get out in front of that narrative and be very open and public and available to try and do some just public education and attempting to explain to folks who will be eligible for that housing and what that housing will look like to try and dispel some of the myths around affordable housing. So in this instance, Rural Development, Inc. is the affordable housing developer. Again, this project went through Planning Board, Historic Commission, CPC, and also just some public engagement sessions held by the developer. And at every one of those steps along the way, there was housing advocates who showed up publicly, and that physical presence of them at those meetings made a difference. In addition, the mayor, if you look at this project to the right, you'll see a small lower section with a fence. That is city-owned land. It was just a quirky strip of land with a building that was falling into the railroad tracks. And the housing developer wanted that piece of land in order to ensure that their building didn't fall into the railroad tracks and to provide them with some green landscaping. And because there was such an outpouring of support for affordable housing and for this project, that made that surplus significantly easier, both to encourage the mayor to surplus the land and to get it through city council approval. Which brings me to the Hope Street lot, which is the project we are in the middle of now. This has had challenges and incredible housing advocacy support along the way. And more than any other project that I've been a part of in Greenfield, I can say that this project in particular would not be moving forward if it were not for our housing advocacy group. This was an instance where they're not just pushing for housing, but they are critical in actually making this housing development possible. So as you can see, this is a municipally owned parking lot. It was taken offline as a parking lot and became the temporary home of our fire station during a time when we were building a new fire station. And about a year ago or so, it was, they were in the process of taking down the temporary fire station because the new one was up and running. And our housing advocates became involved right out of the gate, right then, in the mayor's email box, in her office, in my email box, in my office, pushing for this lot to not go back to parking, but encouraging the mayor to surplus this lot for development as housing. Important to know is if you were standing in the parking lot and looking diagonally across the street, you would be able to see our multi-story public parking garage. Also, you would be able to see right down the hill our transit center. So it's a very centrally located, easily walkable lot right next to the train station and right around the corner from our parking garage. It was a pretty easy sell for the mayor to surplus this for housing, but it did take a demonstration of public support. When this lot was surplused, it made it through city council with no problem. And then it was faced with with public pushback in the form of a referendum vote. There was a petition that was circulated and it was put on the ballot for last November to overturn the city council's vote to surplus the property. Our housing advocacy group at that point in time jumped into a gear I really didn't know that they had and launched an entire Get Out the Vote campaign. They formed a separate entity. They created lawn signs. They did public standouts. They shared information and tried to dispel rumors about what the lot would become. And they were able to do a lot of that one-on-one conversation and public-facing engagement that we as municipal employees couldn't do once it became a ballot question. So again, that piece of it was critical for us to be able to turn to that group and know that they were covering it, that they were out there doing that education and outreach that we couldn't do. They showed up to such an extent that we had a public forum, a debate on surplusing this lot or not. And the city side was myself and the head of our housing advocacy group, Susan Wargaftig, debating against two folks who were on the pro parking lot side. Happily, the referendum was defeated, and we are now moving forward with developing the slot, and we are in the RFP drafting and public engagement phase of the project. And here, what I have noticed is not only is our advocacy group helping folks to show up to public meetings, helping to share information, but we have people in our housing advocacy group with specific skills and technical experience and housing experience and connections that are becoming incredibly helpful. So we've had people from our housing advocacy group who are on planning board who are talking about design guidelines and what that could look like in our RFP. We have people in our housing advocacy group who are connected with developers and who are able to do some direct outreach to developers to talk about whether or not they would respond to this RFP and whether there's information or things that the city could do that would make them more or less likely to respond. And so again, for this project in particular, but for our housing advocacy group, I don't think that we would be moving forward with housing development. And I'll just wrap up by echoing back to what Lily said at the beginning. She said 5 or 10. I'm going to say maybe even 2 or 3 voices that show up, particularly in a city like Greenfield, can make a huge difference. It's a place where I find a handful of advocates can really swing public opinion, whether that's city council vote or just the vibes in a planning board meeting or swatting down some misinformation on social media. And also, I will say for Greenfield, again, as Lily said, in that concept of big tent coalitions, relationships matter for us far more than fancy campaigns or big news stories. And a lot of what our housing coalition has been able to do is build great relationships, not only with people who are housing advocates, but with people who are bike advocates and childcare advocates and employers who realize that their employees have no place to land, and housing developers who maybe are debating developing in Greenfield. Our housing coalition has been able to pull all of those folks together, and the work that they've been doing since they worked with CHAPA is really paying off in this Hope Street lot. So I will end there, and I'm happy to take questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you both so much. It's so wonderful to hear kind of the encouragement for how much can be done without all this money and all this like big kind of organizing groups, but how it can start so small and grow up from there. And also the intersection between developers and advocates and the political cover that it gives and encouragement to leverage local funds is really huge. So it's wonderful to see how all of these things came together. There's lots of excitement in our team chat going on right now about all that you've shared. So congratulations and thanks so much for that. I'm going to jump right over to Keith and then we'll do a paired questions for both of you at the end. So Keith, I'll kick it over to you.
Very good. Let me call my slide deck up here and share it. And here we go. Great. Thanks very much, Keith Bergman. I'm chair of the Concord Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. First, I want to say great to hear from Lily, who we had in Concord to help us get started with MBTA community zoning. And you'll hear how our Concord Housing Roundtable was our local support group for that. Also, kudos to Greenfield, one of my favorite places. My grandson is 8 years old and lives there. He knows that I was the town manager, and so I asked him if Greenfield had one when he was 5 years old. And he said, no, Grandpa, Greenfield is a city and we have a mayor. So I'm so grateful to be on this call with so many housing leaders. And I'm delighted to be able to talk about the Concord Housing Roundtable. I'll begin with a slide that I presented at MHP's 2022 webinar on building your housing infrastructure, helping multiple housing entities work collaboratively. My main message then, as now, is to look for opportunities to engage with your housing partners. This could be updating and implementing a housing production plan or other plans, forming coalitions to support specific projects or initiatives, and having a regular schedule of joint meetings. In Concord, we do those through our Concord Housing Roundtable, currently comprised of the 4 local groups with housing in their name: our Housing Authority, Nonprofit Housing Foundation, the Housing Development Corporation, and the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust, plus the Community Preservation Committee, one of our biggest funders of housing, the Planning Board, and most importantly, the Select Board. We're convened by the Regional Housing Services Office that was established years ago by intermunicipal agreement with our neighbors. And the Housing Roundtable is our focal point for collaborating and sometimes for coping. Our 2022 housing production plan, which was supported by the 4 housing boards, referenced the Housing Roundtable for the first time. We do a housing production plan every 5 years or so. 2022 is the first time it appeared in print, and added a strategy to clarify and track responsibilities to implement the plan together. That plan expires next year, and the trust has already funded an update, which will be launched later this year through the Roundtable. The Concord Housing Roundtable meets quarterly on dates that work for the Select Board. Big lesson learned with big payoff. All 5 Select Board members are usually in attendance. We meet in person at the Concord Townhouse when we can, and we're always on Zoom. We have updates from all 7 of our boards to make sure that we are all on the same page. Our focus is not just on how funds are spent, but also on what regulatory measures should be enacted for the market to produce affordable units. In 2023, Lily briefed us on MBTA community zoning at our Housing Roundtable. Our next meeting is March 30th, where we'll prepare for our April annual town meeting, where we'll have some amendments to MBTA community zoning to complete our compliance. And we'll also be adopting community preservation funding for housing for the coming fiscal year. Before taking a deeper dive into how our roundtable works, I just want to share that in Concord on Monday night this week, many of us got to see the preview of the forthcoming PBS documentary on Concord's own Henry David Thoreau. So with Thoreau on our minds, it airs nationwide beginning next Monday. I wanted to share this 2013 Boston Globe story, which I think speaks to a direct connection between Thoreau and affordable housing in his hometown. In 1990, the newly formed Walden Woods Project had famously and rightly objected to development near Walden. They pledged to work with the town to find an alternative site that could be developed as affordable housing. 23 years after that, back in 2013, that pledge was fulfilled with the legislature's transfer to our Concord Housing Development Corporation of 12 acres of surplus MCI Concord property, which is what's heralded in this Globe headline. That property is called Junction Village, and it's our most impactful example of how long a housing project can take and the importance of having a dynamic process to weather changes and adapt to evolving opportunities. By 2017, the for-profit developer Christopher Heights at Junction Village had approval for 83 affordable assisted living units, $2 million appropriated by the town to support it, and a tax increment financing agreement. But by 2022, COVID-era costs had increased construction from 18 to 26 million. And while the state offered $7 million in ARPA funds, which the trust had the funds, the $1 million to match, the Select Board's relationship with the developer had soured beyond repair. The Select Board said no, and the project died. In the painful post-mortem, we agreed that this could never happen again. the select board would participate on an expanded 7-member roundtable where we would all know what they could say yes to. And in 2024, our world changed when the governor closed MCI Concord. Good news is Junction Village, adjacent to it, is included in the scope of the joint town-state master planning efforts that are currently underway. So perhaps we'll see actual development by within a decade. Affordable housing takes time. Let's take a further look at our Concord Housing Roundtable. In 2017, it began as 3 permanent housing boards and a couple of temporary boards we'll discuss. In 2021, we added a 4th, the Trust, which I've chaired for the last 5 years. And then in 2023, since then, we've had a total of 7 boards on the roundtable. The subsidized housing inventory has been an important scorecard for the roundtable to monitor because we've had many ups and downs. With the 2020 US Census, Concord fell below our 10% goal to 9.97%. We didn't have any other project in the wings besides Christopher Heights to keep us above 10%. 240Bs were quickly filed with a total of 438 rental units, of which 111 will be affordable. One of those 40Bs fell off the SHI last April. The other will fall off next month. But now both plan to pull their building permits and commence construction by this June. Here are the 240Bs. Novo Riverside Commons will be an 8-minute walk to the West Concord MBTA commuter rail station. The residences at Thorough 40B will be an 8-minute drive to West Concord Station. They will bring Concord's SHI to 16%, but only 7% would then be restricted at some affordable level. That's because, as you know, with a rental 40B, for every 1 affordable unit, you get 3 market rate units. Concord would need 200 more deed restricted units to be able to say that 10% of our housing stock is affordable. And that's important in a town where many who work here still cannot afford to live here. So how fortunate we are then that to have the 2 once-in-a-generation initiatives launched by the Select Board, MCI Concord Junction Village Reuse and Redevelopment, and the Land Use Working Group, which is looking at the reuse of town properties through consolidation of municipal departments. These will produce development opportunities, including housing, which is the governor's top priority for MCI Concord. Mindful of these opportunities and working with MHP Intensive Technical Assistance last year, the Trust has brought to our roundtable our refreshed mission, goals, and strategies to advocate that 10% of our housing stock be affordable as part of this blueprint for updating the next iteration of our housing production plan. When the 3 boards began meeting as a roundtable in 2017, a citizen's petition had gone to town meeting, which led to the formation of an affordable housing funding committee. And that plan was developed over the next couple of years with roundtable partners and was overwhelmingly approved in 2019. That plan was to create a municipal affordable housing trust and to fund it by home rule legislation for a real estate transfer fee and a building permit surcharge, appropriating local funds in the meantime. We're still in pursuit of that legislation, by the way. And we formed an Affordable Housing Trust Study Committee, which I chaired, which drafted the bylaw that was approved in 2020. In 2021, the roundtable went from 3 boards to 4 with the establishment of the trust. In 2022, the housing production plan was updated with roundtable member support. And our Concord Housing Development Corporation brought forward a singular opportunity to acquire 7 acres along the Assabet River for open space and affordable housing. And what a project it is. Assabet River Homes is just where affordable housing ought to be. It's 5 affordable units along the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, steps from West Concord MBTA station. Our Concord Housing Authority took ownership of an existing 2-family on that property as affordable rentals, and Habitat for Humanity is currently building 3 ownership units. And we even got Concord Public Works to provide snow and ice removal for the new way that was created. In 2023, the expanded 7-board roundtable had its mission to coordinate housing production plan implementation. The $2 million no longer needed for Christopher Heights at Junction Village was transferred to the trust, along with CPA funds and even ARPA funds for our priority production projects to proceed. The trust has received a total of $6 million since 2019, and we're hoping to add another $785,000 in CPA funds at this year's town meeting. Thus far, we've committed $4.5 million for the projects you see listed here, which will create or preserve 121 affordable units. But we still have much work to do. I'll leave you with this. The biggest challenge and opportunity for the town and the state in Concord, and who knows, maybe we'll even figure out how to fix the Concord Rotary on Route 2 as both MCI Concord and Junction Village are redeveloped. Here's my contact information. Be glad to answer any questions you have. And thanks very much all for your affordable housing leadership.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Keith. It's great to hear how Concord has brought together so many different boards that touch housing all into one room. I think it's very admirable that you've brought them all together. So a question that I wanted to ask, just going back to Greenfield quickly, is does municipal staff work directly with advocates and kind of communicate with them directly, or do advocates generally approach the city first? Like, how does that relationship work? Anything you want to say on that?
Both and all ways. The head of our advocacy group reaches out to me on a daily basis. We routinely attend their monthly advocacy meetings, and we absolutely reach out to them when we need people to show up in support of a project, or we need technical support that we think some member of that committee might have.
Great. So it's like information sharing, upcoming projects, open communication.
Yep. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks so much. So a question on the roundtable in Concord. What is the governance structure for the roundtable? Who chairs it? Are there votes? And then, yeah, let's start with that.
Yeah, I'd have to say it's an informal structure. It is a joint meeting of 7 boards. It is convened by the director of the Regional Housing Services Office, which is based in Concord, which serves 10 towns. That's our support structure. And we have each of the committees going through their list. I usually start off with a presentation from the trust, which includes an update on the subsidized housing inventory and all. But through the process of and it was not set up by a vote of town meeting. We found expression for it. It's one of our strategies in the housing production plan that was adopted by the select board and the planning board. And that was sort of the way that we formalized its existence. And it's those boards that have quorums. Some do and some don't. The ones that don't can still participate so long as they don't deliberate. But it's a chance for us all to have, to just make sure that we're all doing things. And I'd have to, maybe I'm myopic about this, but I see that the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust is sort of the focal point for it because the funds, the agreement among the housing groups has been that the trust, any money that's appropriated should go to the trust. And as the other housing groups need funding, they can come to us at any time. Whenever their project is ready to proceed, the trust would have the funding because we would have all been in support of going to town meeting to get it. Initially, it was free cash. Then there was the $2 million transfer I mentioned, and in the most recent past, it's been community preservation funds exclusively that we receive. So town meeting gives us that, and the trust working with our partners gives the money for projects that we've all agreed to, that are part of our group thing.
Great. You answered a bunch of questions all in that answer. So that was great. One that is coming up is, what is the role of the roundtable? Is it primarily to be aware of one another's activities? Anything you want to say on kind of the importance of the select board's attendance, kind of the role that they have in housing?
Yeah, we all go to town meeting to get our funding. And so it's important that we are in agreement. Let's say, for example, the trust was the only housing group to submit a funding application to the Community Preservation Committee, and that all of the other housing groups are in support of the trust application. So that when we go and get the funds at town meeting, it's to accomplish the greater good. Now, I will say that we want to make sure that process still works for the Community Preservation Committee. And before the trust came along, everyone went to the CPA. You had to know what you wanted in September for the town meeting that was going to take place in the following April or May. And the housing groups certainly prefer not to have to apply that early for a project that they would need funding for.
Great. So it's kind of a chance for you all to learn together, coordinate funding applications. You meet quarterly?
We meet quarterly. We have had we'll have an update on the MCI Concord reuse and redevelopment, which the select board is assigned to yet another committee. But it's there. I guess the background that I should share with you, there are 70 committees in Concord, and just coordinating the committees is an accomplishment. The select board chair convenes all of the committee chairs for a breakfast once a month for 1 hour when we all report in. And I think the housing roundtable is sort of in the tradition of that. Sharing is an important part of making sure that everyone's on the same page, because it's very easy not to be.
Great. And just to keep you on the spot here, Keith, there's a few questions coming up about how you juggle open meeting law and making sure that there aren't decisions being made when there's a quorum of these groups together. Can you talk a little bit about how you juggle that? And then specifically, like, how does decision making and coordination on funding priorities avoid being in violation of open meeting law? Can you talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, all of our meetings are posted. All of the housing roundtable agenda that's in one of the slides is posted as meeting of 7 boards. The other thing that happens that I didn't mention is we all attend each other's meetings so that I go to community, I go to the housing authority meetings, virtually the Housing Development Corporation. They come to ours, and there is just, I mean, frankly, the last thing we're worried about is violating the open meeting law because we have so many open meetings and there's so much deliberation going on. But it's through the camaraderie and the teamwork that is fostered and developed through the roundtable, because there was a time when when I started in 2021 on the trust, I found institutional avoidance of the select board. And having been a town manager for 37 years in various communities, I said to my colleagues, my other housing boards, what do you mean that we have to involve the select board? So we work hard through the roundtable to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, but if anyone has one that they want to ask live, they're welcome to do that. Otherwise, we can give you a little time back. Great. Well, thank you all for joining. I hope this presentation helped to make this work feel a little more accessible, maybe even exciting, and the interconnections between the work that all of these communities and groups do is really interconnected. It is a long process, takes a lot of work. Greenfield kind of outlined how many years of really dedicated work this has taken to get them to this point. So stick with it. This is not easy work. That's why we're all here. And I hope you also hear how welcoming and open these lines of communication are. Lily is very responsive by email. I'm sure Amy would be glad to answer questions if you have any and you want to reach out to her by email. And Keith as well. There's a wealth of knowledge here. So please stay in touch.
If I could just make one point, if anyone wants to hear directly about how a housing roundtable works, I'd be glad to be in touch. I talked to the Sudbury Affordable Housing Trust at their invitation about how the housing roundtable works, and if it can be a benefit for you, I'd be glad to be in touch. Thanks.
Thanks for offering that up, Keith. And thank you so much for you all to take time out of your day to join us for this last module of our 3-part training series. All the slides and the recordings of all of these will be up on our housing toolbox. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for taking time to put these presentations together and share your expertise and knowledge. It is wonderful to hear from all of you and the wonderful work you're doing. Please do fill out the feedback form that will pop up. I think it might also be in the chat if you'd like to log CM credits. Those are also in there, and you can reach out to Reneri if you have any questions. And whether this is the only session you joined us for out of this 3-part series, or you've joined us for all 3, thank you so very much for sharing your time with us, and stay in touch. Thanks, everyone.